thank you so much for coming out. I haven't done this before, but I thought maybe I should give you a vague timeline of the period. The book doesn't cover all of this period, but I'm going to talk a little bit about these things. I won't read through everything now, but we kind of start with the 28 Olympics, and then when some women start running in the 50s, and we go through Joan Benoit and Oprah Winfrey. So I've got a slideshow to show you. We'll go through it. So this is the Sports Illustrated First Sportsman of the Year cover, the end of the year in 1954. It was Roger Bannister. And out in Chardon, Ohio, there was a little farm girl who thought, I want to be a great miler like Glenn Cunningham, Wes Santee, Roger Bannister, and everyone else. She knew about all these great guys. She wanted to do it herself. Of course, she wasn't allowed to, because at the 1928 Olympics in Amsterdam, they did have a half-mile race for women. And at the end of that race, as sometimes happens when you run your guts out for 800 meters, you look a little sweaty and tired and bedraggled at the end. And the Olympic officials, and especially the media, witnessing the disgusting sight of tired women, decided it was a very, very bad thing, and so they promptly banned women from running the 800 meters, which is 2 laps of the track. As many of you know, for the next 30 or 40 years, the longest race for women on the track in the Olympics was 200 meters, which is a half a lap, not even 2 laps around. Not a great photo of Grace Butcher, but you can see that she had a strong, smooth stride, and no doubt with this stride and her intellect and toughness and grit, she could have been a great miler or just about anything she wanted to be. Again, this is the farm girl in Chardon, Ohio. 1958, she won the first time there was finally an 800 meters for women. She was the winner of it at an exhibition at the 58 National Track Championships, which was the first time a number of women in this country got drift of the fact that there would be an Olympic race for them finally 2 years later in 1960. There had been nothing since 1928. Now there was going to be a race in 1960 that they could run in, so the women got very excited about that. I'd love to just show this picture and the text about Grace, because in addition to being a great runner, she was a writer, a horseback rider, a motorcyclist, published a feature story in Sports Illustrated about a solo camping trip on her motorcycle that she made in the 1970s by herself, and obviously strong, brave, independent. Yeah, I think so, like many of the other women in the book, First Ladies. This is the actual finish of the important 1960 Olympic track trials, 800 in Abilene, Texas. The winner is Pat Daniels. She's all of 16 years old, but you can see that she's an incredible powerhouse of a runner. Rose Lovelace was second in this race, and Julia Chase Brand, who's with us, was in the first round of the race, didn't qualify for the finals, but was there in Abilene in 1960, which was a pivotal race for the woman. This is Pat, the winner, 4 years later. She really hated the half mile. It was totally not her event. She was a sprinter, jumper, vaulter, and all of that. She made 2 subsequent Olympic teams in the pentathlon and was on the cover of Saturday Evening Post. And after that, she coached a number of great Olympic track athletes, including Evelyn Ashford, who was a USA Olympic gold medalist in 1984, I believe, and then she got married to a hammer thrower. So she's had a long and glorious career in the sport. This is another dream runner who had far, far too few opportunities in her day. Doris Brown Heritage also got to go to that 1960 Olympic track trials race in Abilene. She finished 3rd in the race. If she had been born 12, 16 years later, she would have been Joan Benoit. She could run anything. She was incredibly talented at all distances and had the passion, fire, and discipline that it took. This is what women's running really looked like in 1960, and that's what Pat really looked like up close. just a slant. I said Pat, I meant Doris. This is Doris finally allowed to run a race more her distance, which is the cross-country championship. There was something called the International Cross-Country Championship. It was maybe 2.5 miles, Julia? Something like that, 4K or something, but much longer than the short track races. She won it 5 years in a row. As I said, she could really run the distances. So one more story about her. I said she could have been Joan Benoit if she had been born later in 1976. And so now we're 16 years after her race at the track trials in 1960. Doris is called by Fred Lebo, who's organizing the first New York City Marathon. And Fred's already got Frank Shorter and Bill Rogers in his race, and he's already got the best woman marathoner, Mickey Gorman, in his race. But he wants someone who can possibly give Mickey some competition. So he's calling Doris and begging her to come to his race in New York City. She's coaching and running in Seattle, Washington. Other side of the country, she tells him it's completely impossible because her team has a meet that day. The team has a meet on Saturday. It's a cross-country meet. They probably have to drive 4 hours someplace in Washington State, run the meet, drive back, etc. New York City Marathon is the next morning in New York. It ain't going to happen. Fred calls 3 or 4 times, and finally Doris said, well, you know, I have been thinking it would be possible for me to take a red-eye flight from Seattle, land in New York at 7 o'clock in the morning, and then run your marathon 2 hours later. Fred said, sure, come on. She actually did that, took the red-eye flight from Seattle, finished second in the marathon to Mickey Gorman. And then in typical Doris fashion, because she is probably the humblest of the humble crowd, and they're all incredibly humble, afterwards at the press conferences, she just apologized profusely for the fact that she didn't run faster and give Mickey Gorman more competition. This is Judy Shapiro Eikenberry, also in that epical race in 1960. She finished 5th. Here she's running a decade later in a marathon in Germany. The interesting part of her story is that 14 years after running the half mile, which to distance runners is considered a short distance, right? It's not one of the longer distances. 14 years later, in 1974, the National AAU finally decides to organize the first marathon for women. So now we're up there at the serious marathon distance, and Judy wins that race. So she was in the race in 1960. She won the first official National Women's Championship Marathon 14 years later. And this is how she traveled. Road trip. She traveled from Southern California in 1960 from Los Angeles to Abilene, Texas in the back of her family's station wagon. I forget how many hours it took, but it was not glamorous in any way, shape, or form, but that's what everybody did back then. Now we come to Julia, who is with us this evening. A few years ago, but basically looking about the same. And so Julia ran the race in 1960 in Abilene, Texas. I keep referring to it. That fall, she went with John Kelly and other local runners to the famous Manchester race outside of Hartford and said, you know, how about it? I want to run. Let me in. I can do this. And they gave her a lot of crap and read her the rules and said, you can't do this. It's against all sorts of regulations. We're not going to let you run. But I'll tell you what, maybe if you enter really early next year in 1961, and you know, if you're a nice, sweet, well-behaved little girl, come back in a year. Maybe we'll let you run a year later. She does all of those things. She comes back in a year. Now it's 1961, and she gets the same crap from the race officials. Sorry, can't run. It's against the rules. It would endanger all the men in the race. There was this stupid rule called contamination. It was like getting Asian flu. It spread. If women were in the race, all the men got sick. So they were told, you know, sorry, thanks for showing up, can't do it. This time she's like, okay, I'm not going to be a nice girl anymore. The bunch of the fat officials joined arms and stood in the road in front of her and 2 other women who showed up, and she was like, yeah, good try, and just ran a sprint around them and kept on going down the road and ran the entire race in her Smith College gym tunic. The Smith College crowd just showed up. Way to go, girls. I hope they didn't make you wear anything like that in your gym school days at Smith College. But Julia ran the race at 7:20 per mile, which a number of you realize is really a pretty darn good pace. Finished ahead of a half dozen of the men and got a whole bunch of attention because Sports Illustrated and the New York Times and Time Magazine were there. So it was a very important date. I like to show this picture of Julia because in addition to being a great runner and many other things, she's an astonishing academic. She got her PhD in zoology, and here she's teaching kids some incredibly important stuff about white mice or rats. I don't think I know the difference, Julia. And after doing that for about 30 years, she got bored and said, I think I'll go to medical school now. So in her mid-50s, she went to medical school and got her degree specializing in psychiatry and is still pursuing that practice to this day. And I note many of the other women in the book had equally as impressive academic and career and all sorts of successes in many, many different fields. And of course, 50 years after first running the Manchester Road Race, Julia went back in 2011, wearing the very same gym tunic from Smith College, and completed the race that day. In fact, I ran with her that day. It was a nice day. We had a wonderful time out there, and she ran a very respectable 11-minute pace, as I recall. We're going just back a couple of years. Well, this is just after Julia's early days. This is actually the first American woman to run a marathon. Her name was Mary Leper, and you can see she didn't have any appropriate running attire of any kind, but she ran this marathon in December of 1963 in Culver City. She's received almost no attention whatsoever through the history of women's running because this was kind of her one big race, a very successful one. 3:37 is very impressive. She was very well trained for the event, and cheering her on the whole way and congratulating her at the end was Julia Chase on the left, because Julia was out training in Los Angeles with a famous coach at that period. So Julia intersects with the sport and the history of women's running in a number of important and interesting ways. This is a more famous woman runner, marathoner named Bobby Gibb. This spring we celebrated the 50th anniversary of her 1966 run in the Boston Marathon. She sent in an entry blank. They said, no, just like Julia, you can't run it. It's against all the rules. You contaminate all the men. There's all kinds of problems. We don't want you. She took a bus from San Diego, California, 3.5 days to Boston. Got to Boston the night before. Talked her mother into driving her to the start. She's wearing her brother's not very well-fitting Bermuda shorts and a bathing suit top. Hid in the bushes, was afraid literally that the police would arrest her. I mean, if they don't let women run, if it's illegal, maybe they throw you in jail. She didn't know, nobody knew. She crept out into the race, started running. The guys were all thrilled to see her. We're always thrilled to see women out there. As I said, when I was young, I was a skinny, nerdy, stupid-looking, geek, and, have some women join us on the starting lines. Who wouldn't want that? So Bobby was incredibly charismatic in a number of ways, a beautiful runner in all the meanings of that word. This is one of my favorite photos. This is Bobby at the 25-mile mark, for those of you who know the Boston course. The vehicle next to her is what we used to call the meat wagon. It's the guys who have dropped out, and they're in the meat wagon getting taken to the finish line in a car, and suddenly someone says, hey, there's a girl out there. And they're all lifting their heads. They can't believe it, and no doubt feeling very, very chagrined that not only did they drop out, but they dropped out in a year when a girl was going to run. So they got beaten several times over by Bobby that day. And again, you just see how good she looks running down the road there, like she could go forever. This is the famous event of the next year, 1967, when Catherine Switzer was attacked on the course by Jock Semple, the Boston official. Same thing, women can't run officially. If they do, all hell will break loose and the world will come to an end, and various things like that. I think it is worth noting that he is not trying to attack, maim, or harm Catherine. He just wants the darn number so that she can't say that she's an official runner, or that there had been a woman runner who looked official in the race. Finally, in 1972, the Boston Marathon officials and the rest of the world, all the people who've been saying no all these years to women runners, finally say, why not? I mean, we can't find any reason why women can't run marathons. If they're silly enough to want to run 26 miles and get blisters and sweaty and all of that, let them go. So these are the first women running with official Boston Marathon numbers in 1972. The eventual winner, Nina Kusik, is F2 on the left. Catherine Switzer is F6. And the one on the right is Sarah Mae Berman, who won 3 times, 69, 70, and 71. And hasn't gotten a lot of attention because she's sort of sandwiched in between the early famous ones and the later famous ones. But she was, and her husband were very, very instrumental in women's running in the Boston area. And Sarah was is an outstanding runner herself. They're still doing Nordic skiing and cross-country races. I like this picture. This is a solitary Hoosier. I just make note of the fact that she's a Hoosier because the middle of the country, aside from Grace Butcher, the Chardon, Ohio girl, the middle of the country is not where you find a lot of athletic activity for girls or women. It's not where there are many opportunities. So Cheryl Pedlow starts running in the mid-60s. A coach talks her into going to a national cross-country race in Boston. She's so nervous and scared that she's going to finish last. She practically talks the coach into taking her home before the race gets started. But she does run it. She finishes 7th or so in a national women's race, which is a wonderful performance, of course. And 4 years later, as Cheryl Bridges, she becomes the first woman to break 2:50 in the marathon out in Los Angeles. So she was tremendously accomplished in her own right. Now she's known for the fact that her daughter, Shalane, has just made her 4th consecutive U.S. Olympic team, the 2nd time in the marathon. So it's a wonderful thing that we did let Cheryl Pedlow run, and she went on and had this daughter who has been the top American runner for the last decade. One other story about Cheryl that's fun to tell. When she was running in high school in Indianapolis, Indiana, it created quite a sensation to the point that the Board of Education decided that they needed to intervene. They had to hold a meeting. They had to discuss the fact that there was this girl running laps around the track and the buildings near Indianapolis, Indiana High School. What should we do about this? What's the right thing? They finally decided that it was totally fine for Cheryl to run her laps around the school buildings. They had a fairly ample campus, as long as she kept out of sight of the boys. She couldn't go anywhere near where the boys were because she would be too distracting to them. And you know how important it was for the boys to concentrate on their sports and be successful at everything they did. So she had to sort of stay in the shadows until her time came. This is the cover of the book and the subject and the winner of the 1984 Olympic Marathon, which was the first Olympic marathon for women, an event that all of the women in the book and many, many others worked very hard for. It took years and years of running the marathon and proving how talented and persistent and dedicated and successful women could be to finally change the minds of the old gray beards and guys who probably looked like me who were sitting on the International Olympic Committee and in other influential places. But they finally succeeded, and Joan, of course, ran the most unbelievable race you can imagine, where she broke away from the field after 3 miles I happened to be lucky enough to be sitting in the stadium where she would eventually come in. We were watching it on monitors, and I remember screaming at the monitor, "Joan, no, slow down, it's too early, it's too early. You're gonna run 23 miles by yourself?" She had had knee surgery just before the Olympic marathon trials that she had to run in the US. Every other country, almost every other country on Earth, the system for picking the Olympic team is different than it is here. The system elsewhere is, okay, you're the best runner, and you're the second best, and you're the third best, and we all know that, so you three are going to the Olympics. And it's based on your performances over the last 3 or 4 years, plus showing that you're still in good shape in 2016 or whatever the Olympic year is. In the United States, no matter whether your name is Joan Benoit or Carl Lewis or whoever it is now, your reputation is worth nothing. You have to show up at the Olympic trials on race day and finish in the top 3 on that particular day. And it's not easy to do when you've had knee surgery 17 days earlier, but that was the case with Joan. She made it through the trials and came back and just destroyed everyone. I had the incredible fortune to run Oprah Winfrey's marathon. She's only run one. I was there. I was the editor of Runner's World magazine. I thought, well, if Oprah Winfrey's running and I'm the editor of Runner's World magazine and she's the most famous person who's ever run a marathon, then I've got to run it with her, be able to write a story about it because our readers will be potentially interested in it. She was surrounded by National Enquirer reporters in red. National Enquirer had 5 or 6 photographers on motorcycles following her every inch of the way, hoping that some disaster would befall her and they could take photos and it would sell 1 million copies of National Enquirer. The one thing that really happened that I remember clearly and often tell is about, she had been hydrating a lot during the race. It was a cool, rainy day. You didn't really need a lot of hydration, but everyone was telling her to drink. So she drank, and about the 20-mile mark, we went past a row of porta potties, which they have on the courses at marathons. And Oprah went by it, and I could tell by the way she looked longingly at the porta potties that she really wanted to go in and relieve herself, but she wasn't going to give the National Enquirer photographers the opportunity to take pictures of her going in and out of a porta potty. The other thing that was amazing, in which I really, really credit her with, is, first of all, she comes from a completely non-athletic background. There have been virtually no African-American women marathoners in this country. Her weight problems are well known to all. And in this race, the newspaper leaked the story 2 days early. So there's 20,000 people in the race. Everybody knows that Oprah's around them somewhere, and we're all running down the road, and people see her. The runners see her, the spectators see her. They all come up to her and say, "Oprah," clap her on the back, "we're so glad you're out here. You're such an inspiration. Love your show. Have a great race. Love you. Good going." And in the early miles of the race, she was trying to be nice, and every time she got tapped, she looked back and she acknowledged the person and smiled and said thank you or whatever. But if you've run a marathon, or if you can even imagine running a marathon, you realize that there comes a point in the race where you ain't got energy for anything except hopefully moving 1 foot forward at a time and keeping your stride going. So she could no longer acknowledge people, but she kept on trudging along. She held her pace, and she did a really remarkable job of it. Afterwards, we put her on the cover of Runner's World magazine, and I was the editor at the time, and I was very, very nervous about this cover. You won't understand it now, but literally among Runner's World readers, there were 0% of African-American women. We'd never had somebody on the cover who'd been a former overweight or whatever you want to say. And it just wasn't clear to me that anybody would actually buy this cover of the magazine. Turned out to be our best-selling cover ever on newsstand. And the cover line message, "Oprah did it, so can you," really, really resonated with people, because think about it. Before this, everyone thought that to be a marathoner, you had to look like me or look like Joan Benoit, win the Olympic marathon, and most of us know we're not going to win the Olympic marathon, and we're not that much like Joan Benoit, so if she runs 100 miles a week, that doesn't mean we should run 100 miles a week, week in and week out. But then Oprah goes out there, runs the marathon, doesn't win the Olympic medal, finishes in the middle of the pack, but finishes in a time 4 hours and 29 seconds, which now is literally right at the 50th percentile of all people who run marathons in this country. At the time, it was probably more like the 80th percentile, but thanks to her, more and more people are running, more women are running, more ethnic women are running, and that spreads things out, and you have a balance of fast and slow runners. And she really did more for women's running, I think, than anyone ever. It's worth noting that Joan won the Olympic marathon in 1984, and Oprah ran it in 1994, and the women's running boom has all happened since the mid-90s onward. Nobody can prove that Oprah was the cause of it. Nobody can prove anything. We don't know why women started running all of a sudden in the mid-1990s. But we do know that they didn't start running in the mid-1980s, which is when Joan Benoit had just won the Olympic marathon. So that, in short, is what my book is about. I want to make one more acknowledgement, and that, of course, is to John Kelly, who many of you know from his many years of teaching and running in Mystic and Groton. This is an old photo, is appropriate to the women's photos I've been showing you. This is what I looked like. My daughter's laughing. This is what New England road running looked like in the 1960s, when most of the races were held in a high school locker room or an American Legion home or someplace filled with sour beer and cigarette smoke, is what I remember of the places that we ran. So this is what we looked like after the race, and I suppose after a shower. And John's wonderful smile, everybody looks at him and thinks Kennedy's, especially Robert Kennedy, things like that. But he was the warmest, most wonderful human being a person could know, and a great inspiration in my life, not for the lessons he taught me about running, which were infinite and all-important, not all-important, but infinite and important, but for the lessons he taught me about life and people and the environment and work ethic and things like that. And I will also note that John Kelly was a significant influence on Julia Chase Brand's running career. And Julia, that would seem to be a transition to you.
It is hard to believe that it was so different then, but when they said we weren't allowed to run, it was on all kinds of levels. If you told a doctor that you were running, they said, you better be careful, your uterus, it doesn't, it can fall out. I had a doctor, a gynecologist I went to, and I found out about my running history, and he said, "Oh, so you must be half male, right?" I was 24 at the time, and I cried all afternoon. It was like, oh, and it was just astounding how people believe these things. And Amby's always nice, but what happened about banning women from running, it wasn't an accident. It was an intentional hoax after the 1928 Olympics. There had been a lot of opposition. The people who founded the new Olympics didn't want women in them. They just didn't, whether it was Duquesne or Coubertin or Avery Brundage. And when the 880 was run, it was a good tactical race. I can show you the footage of it. But when I was growing up, they told me what the footage was. It was these women ran, and they all collapsed at the finish line, and they were agonized and great. It was a terrible disaster. And none of that happened. Nobody fell down. Well, one person fell at the finish line and got right up again. About 3 seconds later, she was up on her feet. None of that happened, and yet the New York Times and the other American papers and one English paper had this disaster story. And there were photographs of these disastrous women, collapsing on the finish line. They weren't women who were in the race. It was photoshopped, or what you did in the old days. They were actually other people's pictures that they chose and printed. And up until the 1960 Olympic trials, we were still being told that everybody had collapsed. about 5 years ago, I retired from being a psychiatrist. I'm back at it now. But I looked up all my old friends from the 1960 Olympic trials because I was really curious what had happened to all of us, and that's where some of Amby's information comes from too. And it was a wild set of lives we all led. You know, like you said, Grace Butcher was out there on her motorcycle writing columns and doing poetry readings and, you know, all kinds of crazy stuff. And the whole thing of going to the 1960 Olympic trials, I had run my first race. They were just beginning. I'd run my first race 2 weeks before the Olympic trials. Can you imagine your second race is the Olympic trials? And everybody had a crazy story. Doris Severtson spent a week on a train to get there. George Terry, Johnny's running mate, and I had the privilege of flying down, and our plane caught fire at 3 in the morning and had to do an emergency landing and so on. I mean, there were crazy stories. I was wearing my brother's, you know, little shorts and T-shirt. There were no shoes for women. I had George Terry's shoes, which were 2 sizes too large, duct taped onto my feet to run the Olympic trials. The person next to me was 50 years old and had a gold medal and a silver from sprinting in the 1932 and 1936 Olympics, and was actually, she was half male, it turned out, on autopsy. So it was a crazy world, and everyone has a million stories, but that's all I wanted to say.
Stay up here and we'll see what questions we've got, okay?
I have one thing. The AAU, the national organization, the head of the AAU took me aside after the Life magazine article and said, "Oh, Julia, you're so pretty. Do you see Grace Butcher down there? She used to be pretty too before she tried to run distance." And I couldn't tell Grace that for 50 years, and I finally told her 3 years ago, and she roared with laughter. She thought it was very funny, but that was the level of it all. Yeah.
Were other sports also subject to the same anti-feminist, like the swimming or ice skating?
Running was a little bit different because the Olympic group held control on that, and Avery Brundage held control of the AAU for 50 years almost, from 28 to early 60s, 40 years. And he had a particular bee in his bonnet. You know, he was somebody who wanted to marry a princess and did, literally did. Very, very old school. In swimming, no, that was closer to the same. Basketball, of course, we had half court. Baseball, you had to have a softball instead of a hardball. So there were smaller things. Equestrian was always equal. Fencing was always equal. What am I missing?
Well, I think what I would add is that running was the only sport that was on a small scale a mass participation sport. So Julia Chase running at Manchester could have made me ineligible to run in the Olympics because, you know, The
final thing was to say that the men, if the men are in the race, they'll get, but that was secondary. The primary thing was aimed at the women who would.
Right, right.
I don't think Johnny
Right.
Kelly was ever threatened.
No, certainly not. Certainly not.
Kelly was so grand. He was so grand. They just took us in, us weird waifs, and you know, fed us cookies and tea, and that's the way we got into running.
Do you want to tell your story about seeing him when you were young?
When I was 5, I ran to school, 1.5 miles if I missed the bus. Okay. But then there was this Kelly running around the golf course, and I was actually going to Mass every day during Lent.
Julia lived over near Shanachosset somewhere. I'm still not exactly clear. Eastern Point.
Acres Cove. We used to canoe to school too, up the backwaters of the west side. But we saw Kelly every day out there running, and I just became an incredible fan of his at 12, 13, 14. Then he won Boston in '57. He named his eldest daughter after me. I'm flattered, unbelievably. And then one day I'm out running the tracks, and who should come along but Kelly, and I got absolutely tongue-tied and unable to talk, but eventually did talk, and invited me over, and they just took me in. It was okay with them. So.
As some of the restrictions on women in running were starting to get, or loosen up a little bit, did that trickle down into like high school and like public school systems, or did that not happen? I mean, what kind of happened first? Did, young girls in school athletics?
Well, I think trickle is probably the right word. Everything trickled down. And all the people I know, we talk about Title IX, which was 1972, and we assume that the door opened and the floodgates followed. And when I talked to women from that period, they said, it took at least a half dozen years before there was virtually any effect from Title IX. And then slowly there began to be programs that they could aspire to.
And Title IX, of course, was the replacement for Equal Rights Amendment, which the United States, we still don't have Equal Rights Amendment in our Constitution.
Do you think that the popularity of women's sports now, especially for kids, is important for women in dealing with what's still a very patriarchal society?
Absolutely, absolutely. If you can get out there and run, first of all, you feel good, and you look good, and you're healthy. Secondly, you guys, I bet you run faster than some of the guys in your school, I bet, or wherever you run. And when you get out into I went to graduate school, and I was the first woman to go into this particular PhD program. And when they began doing this stuff, it was sort of like, I'm okay. They just have a problem. And so, yes, I think there's a tremendous... You go through the people who ran in 1960, and you have more PhDs than at a national convention. It's just amazing how many people really went on and did interesting things. I think it has a big carryover. If your feet are bound and you're walking like this all your life, you're not going to feel very robust when you get out there in the working world.
Well, again, thank you very much for coming. We'd be happy to answer individual questions if any of you want to come up. And yes, we have some books for sale at the front. So thank you.